It's strange how one moment, one look, one laugh, one dismissive gesture can cut deeper than 1,000 words. She had been in that Gucci store no more than 5 minutes. A soft hum of music played in the background. The scent of perfume floated in the air, thick and exclusive. And yet, what she remembers most clearly is the tightening in her chest when the sales associate tilted her head and said, "Ma'am, are you lost?" She wasn't lost. She was sent. Wearing Conor McGregor's initials on a sleek black credit card, the maid had arrived with a simple task: purchase a gift, something elegant, something worthy. But the moment she stepped inside, in plain clothes, worn shoes, and hands that told of work, she was no longer a customer. She became invisible, or worse, an inconvenience. The humiliation didn't come from being asked if she belonged there. It came from the snickers exchanged between 2 staff near the jewelry counter. It came from the way no one offered her a seat. From how every sentence was short, cold, clipped. She wasn't seen as someone with taste or value, only as someone out of place. And here is where Adlerian psychology speaks with piercing clarity. Alfred Adler taught that we are shaped by feelings of inferiority, often born from early experiences of rejection or humiliation, and that much of our adult lives are spent trying to compensate for these perceived shortcomings. Not through arrogance or greed, but through a deep need to belong, to matter. The maid, though not poor in character, was poor in status. And in that high-end store, surrounded by curated luxury, she was treated as a symbol of what should not be present. The reaction wasn't personal. It was systemic, deeply embedded in social hierarchies, in a culture where appearance dictates respect. Her tears didn't fall in the store. They waited until she was safely back in the car, the gift bought, the bag beside her. But something had shifted. She would never walk into a store like that again, not as someone on an errand, not like that. And maybe, she thought, not ever. If this reflection has already touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. What part spoke to you the most? Now, let's continue. There's a kind of quiet pride that working class people carry, one that doesn't demand applause, but still aches when ignored. The maid, whose hands had cleaned floors and carried trays, had never asked for more than basic decency. Yet, in that moment at Gucci, what was stripped from her wasn't a material thing. It was her dignity. Alfred Adler believed that every individual, regardless of background, seeks a place of significance. Not superiority, but significance, a sense of purpose, of being seen and valued by others. He argued that when this need is unmet, people either withdraw in silence or react with compensatory behaviors. Often that reaction is misinterpreted, but it is always rooted in a longing to be accepted as equal. The maid didn't scream or argue. Her reaction was inward. In silence, she made the kind of decision that feels small on the outside, but is revolutionary on the inside. She decided never to put herself in that position again. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had finally recognized that there are spaces built to humiliate, not elevate. This chapter of her life mirrored the experience of so many others: domestic workers, caregivers, assistants, who serve behind the scenes in a world obsessed with visibility. It's easy to forget that behind every celebrity is someone folding their clothes. Behind every executive lunch is someone scrubbing the dishes after. And these people, mostly women, often immigrants, and almost always underpaid, live lives where the spotlight never reaches. But here's the truth Adler helps us understand. Social interest, as he called it, is the glue of a healthy society. When we lose respect for those who serve, we corrode that glue. Our community that elevates only the rich and polished ultimately collapses under its own emptiness. The maid wasn't looking for pity. She was looking for recognition, for her humanity to be acknowledged, just as she had always acknowledged the needs of others. And in that Gucci store, what shattered wasn't just her pride. It was the illusion that good work is enough to earn respect in all spaces. She now understood. Dignity must be claimed, not expected. And sometimes to protect that dignity you must walk away, even if the world sees your walk as surrender. In American culture, we often romanticize the idea of working your way up. The belief that if you serve long enough, work hard enough, remain loyal enough, eventually someone will notice. Eventually, you'll be rewarded. But for many in service roles, that moment of recognition never comes. Instead, years of quiet labor are met with silence. The maid's relationship with McGregor's household was professional. She was paid. She was trusted. But she was also invisible, not by intention perhaps, but by function. Like many in her position, she had mastered the art of making herself small, entering rooms quietly, anticipating needs, fading into the background. She had, without realizing it, become fluent in self-erasure. Adler would describe this as a dangerous imbalance of power. When a person consistently prioritizes the needs of others above their own and receives little validation in return, their sense of personal significance begins to erode. Over time, they stop expecting fairness. They stop asking for respect. They start to believe that their role, and by extension their value, is limited to how well they can serve. But service is not submission. And humility should never require humiliation. In that Gucci store, what erupted wasn't just a moment of classism. It was the consequence of long-term emotional neglect, not just from strangers, but from a society that places people in roles and forgets the human behind them. For a maid to be respected, she must be more than the help. She must be seen as a person, with tastes, boundaries, emotions, and pride. When the sales associate looked at her with condescension, it wasn't just a momentary slight. It echoed years of being overlooked. It echoed every holiday missed with family, every thankless double shift, every time someone handed her a tip instead of a kind word. In psychological terms, she was experiencing what Adler described as a crisis of belonging. Humans don't just need shelter or income. We need connection, the kind that says, "You are here and you matter." The silence that followed her return from Gucci wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. Because for the first time she realized she had accepted too little for too long. And that realization, painful as it was, marked the beginning of her transformation. There are moments in life that don't just hurt, they reshape us. When the maid sat alone later that night, the Gucci bag untouched beside her, she didn't cry out of sadness alone. She cried because something inside her had shifted, something that would not go back to the way it was. Alfred Adler believed that every feeling of inferiority has the potential to ignite compensation, not in a material or vengeful sense, but as a psychological drive towards self-assertion. It's in those moments when we feel most disregarded that we begin to ask, what am I worth really? And who gets to decide that? That night, she began to answer those questions, quietly, without theatrics. She looked at her hands and didn't just see age or fatigue. She saw sacrifice, years of labor that had allowed someone else to succeed, to shine, to walk into stores like Gucci and be welcomed. Her hands had cleaned floors before big interviews, washed sheets for celebrations. She had made other people's lives feel dignified, yet had rarely been given dignity in return. This is what Adler called the creative self, the part of us that interprets our experiences and shapes our future. It's not what happens to us that defines us, he said. It's how we choose to respond. And this time she chose differently. She didn't return the bag. She didn't complain to her employer. Instead, she made a promise to herself. This chapter of her life would no longer be defined by silence. The decision wasn't dramatic, but it was profound. She would leave her job, not out of rage, but out of clarity. She would no longer serve in spaces where she was unseen. She began slowly to reconnect with dreams she'd buried. The desire to study, to speak better English, to learn how to manage a small business. At 49, she felt foolish even thinking about it. But then again, hadn't she earned the right to dream? Adler reminds us that striving for superiority is not about being better than others. It's about being better than we used to be. For her, that meant no longer accepting invisibility as her fate, no longer defining herself through the reflections in others' eyes. She wasn't walking away from work. She was walking toward herself. The United States prides itself on the idea of a classless society. But anyone who's lived long enough knows, class isn't about money alone. It's about who is given permission to belong and who must constantly prove themselves just to be in the room. When the maid entered that Gucci store, she technically had purchasing power, a valid credit card, a clear task, but emotionally, socially, she had no permission, no aura of belonging, and that, not the price tags, is what made her unwelcome. Adler's perspective cuts deep here. He believed that the roots of inferiority aren't just personal, they're social. When a society treats certain roles as less than human, it plants the seed of shame in the hearts of those who hold those roles. Over time, the shame doesn't feel external. It feels earned, it becomes internalized. This is the psychological weight of classism. It's not just about being underpaid. It's about being underseen, having to smile when you're dismissed, having to be polite when someone talks down to you, having to say thank you for crumbs of civility. And for those over 45, especially women in caregiving or service roles, this story resonates with painful clarity. Many have lived whole decades performing invisible labor, raising children, managing homes, supporting others' dreams. They've smiled through exclusion, stayed quiet to keep the peace, believed, maybe even still believe, that dignity must be earned by endurance. But Adler reminds us, we are not what society tells us we are. We are who we choose to become, even in the face of deep-seated judgment. And transformation begins when we stop asking for permission. For the maid, that transformation began not with a raise or a reward, but with a refusal. A refusal to continue defining her self-worth through the reactions of people who never saw her to begin with. She realized she could walk into any room, not because she belonged in their eyes, but because she had finally claimed the right to belong in her own. And that kind of permission, it's not given, it's taken. There are revolutions that roar, and there are revolutions that unfold in silence over tea-stained journals and second-hand books. For the maid, what followed was not a spectacle, but a deep, private awakening. She didn't buy a car or travel the world. She enrolled in an evening class at the community center. She watched videos on how to open a small cleaning business. She called a cousin she hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had always believed in her. This is what Adler meant when he spoke about courage. Not the kind of courage that rushes into danger, but the subtler, more radical kind. The courage to believe, after years of being made to feel small, that you are enough, that you are capable, that you deserve to take up space. The maid didn't hate her old job. She had gratitude for what it taught her, how to listen, how to anticipate needs, how to show up even when tired. But she no longer wanted to live in the shadows of someone else's success. Her decision wasn't about rejection, it was about reclamation. In many ways, her story echoes that of thousands across America. Older adults rediscovering themselves after lifetimes of sacrifice. People who were mothers before they were women, workers before they were dreamers. People who put their own needs last for decades and now find themselves asking, what if there's still time? And there is. The self-worth she began to rebuild was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady, grounded. She stopped apologizing for her accent, stopped dressing down to make others feel comfortable. She began choosing spaces that welcomed her, rather than enduring those that tolerated her. Adler's teachings remind us, the goal of the human spirit is not perfection, it's growth. And growth, at its core, is the choice to become someone who no longer waits for others to define their worth. Her revolution wasn't visible to the world, but inside, it was seismic. And for the first time she felt it. She didn't need Gucci to tell her she had value. She already knew. In a world obsessed with youth, reinvention after 45 is often met with skepticism. But for those who've lived enough life to understand loss, loyalty, and limits, success begins to mean something entirely different. For the maid, success no longer meant working for someone admired by millions. It meant building something, however small, that belonged to her. The first months were shaky. She didn't have much savings, and starting a business was intimidating. But Adler's view of human development hinged on one essential principle: striving towards significance. Not dominance, not fame, but personal, authentic contribution. And in that sense, her new path was profoundly aligned with Adler's ideals. She began offering specialized cleaning services with a twist. She emphasized care for elderly clients, people who felt isolated, forgotten. Her work wasn't just physical, it was emotional labor transformed into connection. She brought warmth, music, small thoughtful touches. Within months, referrals grew. Clients weren't just hiring a cleaner, they were welcoming someone who respected them and who expected respect in return. This, Adler would say, is the ideal endpoint of compensation. When we use the pain of past inferiority not to harm or dominate others, but to uplift ourselves and serve society in healthier ways. Her past as a maid wasn't erased, it became the foundation. The empathy she had developed, forged in years of being overlooked, became her most powerful asset. Older viewers across the US may recognize parts of themselves in this. The moment you stopped chasing someone else's idea of achievement and started listening to your own quiet voice. Maybe you've switched careers, maybe you've gone back to school. Maybe you've simply learned to say no with grace. That is transformation. And it doesn't need to look glamorous. It only needs to be real. The Maid didn't broadcast her journey, but those who knew her saw the change. In her posture, in her speech, in the way she walked into a store and not daring to belong but knowing she did. That is the kind of success that can't be bought. It can only be claimed. Years later, no one would remember the saleswoman at Gucci. No one would recall the exact day or the details of the humiliation. But she remembered, not out of bitterness, but because that moment had unknowingly set her free. Freedom for her didn't come with applause or recognition. It came from the simple, steady realization that she mattered, with or without anyone else's approval. Adler taught that our ultimate psychological goal is to feel that we belong, not as a decoration in someone else's life, but as a participant in our own. She belonged now, in rooms she chose, in a business she built, in a life that finally fit her skin. There was no bitterness toward McGregor or his world. In fact, she sent a polite letter when she left, expressing gratitude and honesty. She wished them well, but she no longer needed proximity to fame to feel important. This is the shift that often comes in midlife, especially for those who've served quietly for years. The hunger for validation softens. The need for authenticity grows. You begin to ask, who am I without the roles I've played? What do I want now that I've given so much of myself to others? And in answering those questions, something beautiful emerges: self-respect. Her story isn't rare. Across America, especially among older women and immigrants, similar stories unfold every day. Quiet acts of defiance, reinvention, courage. People who have been underestimated for decades deciding finally to write their own narrative. Adler believed that each individual holds within them a unique purpose, shaped by their pain and their potential. And when we stop waiting to be invited in, when we step forward with that quiet sense of worth, we don't just change our own lives, we subtly, powerfully change the culture around us. The Maid never entered Gucci again, but she did something far more radical. She stopped entering spaces that couldn't see her, and she began creating ones that did.